Good evening. Welcome to our spring study, Daniel, Hope for the Faithful. I am glad to see everyone here tonight. I'm excited about this study. We're going to be in the Old Testament book of Daniel, and it is set in a specific time in the history of the people of Israel, which, the Bible tells the story of the people of Israel. And so there's a lot of events that have gone before that. So I thought we would do kind of a quick timeline just to place this in the story of the scripture. Sometimes we know a lot of stories and we don't always know where they belong. Y'all, I don't know if you've had that experience of like, wait, is this before that thing or after that thing? So I'm going to turn on the whiteboard and try to not have technical difficulties. And let's go ahead and someone tell me some events that are covered in the story of scripture, and we can, always go out of order if we need to. Throw some out there.
You mean the story of Daniel or the
story start from the beginning, Adam and Eve?
Yeah, creation, Adam and Eve. Yep, start from the beginning. Like if you were going to kind of map out what's in the Bible, then we want to know where Daniel falls. So let's talk about what's in the Bible. Okay, so we have the story of creation. What else?
Noah's Ark.
Yeah, the flood. All that kind of comes sort of prehistory. There's a prehistory section. Then what?
Tower of Babel.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that next week.
Jericho.
Okay, so Jericho happens when they are doing the conquest of the land, when the people of Israel come back to the land. And where were they coming from? Does anyone remember?
Sorry, I'm flipping through the books and it just Jericho popped out to me.
Yeah.
Something made me think of Jericho. So
no, that's good.
They came from Egypt.
I couldn't hear that. Someone try again.
Oh, they came from Egypt.
Okay, right. So the Exodus is the main story of, out of Egypt. They go wandering in the desert. They get the law. All of that stuff happens. What's before Exodus out of Egypt?
Well, Moses and the burning bush.
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to put that in here. Moses.
There was Moses, Jacob, and Joseph, and the whole story and the creation of Israel.
Okay, right. So the nation of Israel begins with the time of the patriarchs. So we have, and by the patriarchs, I mean Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And these three are kind of, the age of the patriarchs begins earliest, probably 2000 BC, just to give us a little, bit of a structure there for our timeline. So we have this sort of prehistory of the creation, the flood, the Tower of Babel, and then we get the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob has the 12 sons. His name is also Israel. That's how we get the nation of Israel. And then Jacob has his sons because of the way the brothers treat Joseph. They end up in Egypt and then over time are enslaved, and then they have to be rescued out of Egypt. And then they come back to conquest to the land of Canaan. What's after that as you're flipping through those books?
The time of Judges.
Yeah, Judges are next. This was a time that there wasn't a king in Israel. They have a period where they're just sort of ruled by, they're not really ruled. They have kind of warrior leaders that arise out of their tribes. And then after that, they really want kings. And so what time comes after that?
after
Is
the
that about the
kings?
time of Samuel?
Yeah, Judges, and then Samuel's kind of the hinge of that, right? He's the
Mhm.
last of the judges in the next book. The book of Judges is structured around 12 judges, and Samuel's in the next book, right? But that all leads into Samuel, and then who comes next?
Saul.
Saul. Yes,
Then
we have 3 kings of the United Kingdom. Saul, and then maybe the most famous is
David.
David, and then his son Solomon. So this time of Saul, David, Solomon this is kind of the glory days of the nation of Israel, and this runs about 1000 BC. So as we're kind of building a little structure, sort of understand the story of Scripture, we have like earliest that's really historical, like Abraham 2000 BC, and then David 1000 BC, and then after that, what happens? After Saul, David, Solomon.
Kingdom
Israel
split.
splits.
Yeah, this is the kingdom splits. We have a divided kingdom. They do, they're split into north and south. They have a bunch of kings, the north is called Israel, which is confusing because the whole thing is Israel, right? But then, and the south is called Judah after the primary tribe in the south. And then eventually, the north, this time where they have this divided kingdom, there are all these kings, and they just make a hash of it. It's a mess. The north is like an unmitigated disaster, one after the other. The south has a few bright spots, but overall, things go downhill, and they act very poorly. They worship other gods. They oppress the poor and the vulnerable, and eventually, the northern kingdom falls into exile, falls to Assyria. And this is around 722 BC. Once we get to this part of the timeline, we start having exact dates because the things that happen can be mapped to the history of other nations who also kept records from astronomy. And so like we can go back and say, oh, we know when this eclipse was. And so we can date it. We can date things with certainty. So once we get into this period, now we're into like reliable dates. So the northern kingdom goes into exile, and then the southern kingdom also goes into exile. Anyone remember who they go to exile to?
Babylon.
Yeah. Okay, so we're kind of up to the present, and this is, I want to make sure I get this right. I think it's 586. Yes. I'm not super good with remembering a million dates, and so this is my structure. I remember earliest time of the patriarchs 2000, David 1000, the southern kingdom into exile 586 BC, and that kind of gives a framework, right? Sort of like what kind of history or how many years are we looking at? How many centuries? Okay, so this brings us to the present that we're going to be studying. So let's turn over to 2 Kings. And if you're new to these studies, I always put the readings for each study on a page with study questions, readings, and if you don't have that, I'll make sure to put a link on at the end, but it's available on my website. So you could go to deannamunger.com and click at the top and see it. So I have a reading from 2 Kings 24. So if you want to turn over there, will someone read for us 2 Kings 24, 8 through 16. And this is deep into the divided kingdom when we're almost to the end and things are going very poorly.
Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan. She was from Jerusalem. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father had done. At that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiakim prisoner. As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace, and cut up the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and fighting men, and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the prominent people of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 skilled workers and artisans.
Thank you. Okay, so give us a recap. What happens in this section? I've chosen a cheery reading for this evening. But what's the summary? What happens?
Jerusalem's destroyed and Nebuchadnezzar took him over.
Yeah, he comes in, he lays siege to Jerusalem. He doesn't what does he do? Okay, so you mentioned destroyed, and it actually doesn't get completely destroyed till the next chapter when it's like burned and completely razed. But what does he do specifically?
He destroyed the temple.
The temple, and what'd you say, Amy?
He took captive the king.
Yeah, okay. So he takes the stuff from the temple, right? The temple had specifically all of these gold, beautiful vessels, it calls them, or articles sometimes. These are like cups and plates and things that were used, lampstands, things that were used for worship. But because they're made of precious metals, he takes them away. He sacks the temple and captures, loot, right? And takes it home. And then, as Amy said, he takes people. What kind of people does he take?
He takes the king and his family and all of the important governmental position people.
All the government, all the king, the family, the nobles. Yep, definitely. Who else? What other categories?
Men of valor and skilled workers.
Okay, so these got the warriors, right? All the fighting men, strong and fit for war. These men of valor, takes them away. And then these artisans. So what's the theme here? What do you notice? What's he doing?
Taking the best.
Taking the best. Yeah, exactly. And we're going to come back to that as we continue our study because, he's Nebuchadnezzar and he wants the best, right? So this is, the thing that has happened at the end of a long story. And I want to read you a tiny section right before this. This is still in 24, and it says, Verse 3, surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command, in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh and all he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood. For he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. So why did this happen? Why were they taken into exile? Why were they captured?
Because the community was doing practices that I mean, they're sacrificing children to other gods. They've basically left the faith. They're not.
Yeah, that's very well put. So, that we saw them worship other gods along with the true God over the story of Scripture. But then when they start abusing the populace, shedding innocent blood, sacrificing children, like all of these things are so wicked that God, says, the things that I told you would happen if I stopped protecting you are going to happen because of your behaviors. And so we have this very clear message, and this is really the theme of these books. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings tell the long story in retrospect from the point of view of exile, people in exile, saying, how did we get here? What went wrong? How did this happen? How did we land? If we were God's people and we had God's protection, how did we land in such a terrible situation? And so the 2nd Kings is very clear about, like, God did this, right? All right, turn over, and we're going to, I mentioned that here as we start, and we're going to come back to that idea next week as well. Okay. Turn over to Daniel chapter 1. We're going to look for where we overlap in the story. Will someone read chapter 1, verses 1 through 5?
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king.
Okay. What translation is that?
English Standard Version.
Okay. So you have some. We're gonna talk next week about how God gives Nebuchadnezzar into his hand. That'll be a key word. I also noted that your translation said Chaldeans in a spot where some of our others would say Babylonians. Let's see, verse 4, the language and literature of the Chaldeans, or the language and literature of the Babylonians. The history of Babylon is such that this people that we call Babylon is technically Neo-Babylonians or Chaldeans. So those are synonyms. And so when we see Chaldeans in this period, we're talking about the same group of people as the Babylonians. So there's a good one. Let's see. Where is the overlap in our story from 2nd Kings to Daniel? What do you notice that has, points of commonality?
You have God giving the people over to Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah. So we have particularly Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned in both, right? Look, I spelled it. I'm so proud. So we have Nebuchadnezzar, and we saw the carrying off of the people. What other commonality point is mentioned?
Don't they both say it's in Jehoiakim's 3rd year of reign?
Yes. So there's a discrepancy there. this says Jehoiakim, and wait, Kim. This probably actually happens in the reign of Jehoiachin. But you have the mention of the Israelite king and the defeat of Jerusalem. And also notice he doesn't just carry off the best people, he carries off what?
The articles of the treasure of the house of God.
Yeah, temple treasure, exactly. So we can tell we're at that same point in this story, right? This year that I gave you, 586 BC, is the year from not 2 Kings 24, which we read, but 2 Kings 25, when the temple is actually burned and Jerusalem is completely destroyed. And so this is right before that. But you can tell we're at the same point in the story. So that's where we're landing. And then we'll look further down the road into the history as we go on. After this, the Jews are in exile for a time. Eventually, they are sent back into the land to rebuild. And, there's other kind of overlords of that land that take us all the way up to Rome and the turn of the millennium when Jesus is born. And so that kind of covers our history BC. Questions on the timeline or kind of where we are in history at this point? Okay, I'm going to turn this off.
Did the king reign for 3 months or 3 years?
This is actually a point of mismatch. This is the historical setting of Daniel, and that's why I did that sort of history exercise. But there is a discrepancy when we talk about history in Daniel. The Daniel 1, and let me see, we're out of order on my notes, so now I'm scrolling down so that I can make sure I find the information here and say it right. Daniel 1:1 says Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. That would have been like 606 BC, so like several years before 586, from because we're in BC. I always have to remind myself of that. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't actually come to power till 605, a year after that, according to Jeremiah 25 and according to Babylonian records. And his first attack on Jerusalem was in 598 BC. And so we have a little mismatch in the historical record here. And what we think is that Daniel is slightly off on where they put this attack. And we'll talk more about like what that means and how much we care about that when we sort of talk genre, because we're going to do that today.
Now, if you look at the end of 2 Kings 23, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. And it says in 24:1, during Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land. And then Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. And then Jehoiakim became king.
The scholars have really worked hard to try to match those up. And they're really hard to match up. And what it looks like is that the records in Kings, Daniel, Isaiah, all of those match up with Babylonian historical records, and Daniel is the outlier. So hold on to that and we'll come back to it because I want to not skip this. I scrolled down pages of notes and I don't want to skip all that. So, okay. We see the historical context, like even whether, those years, getting those years exactly right, we see that this has happened in a point in Israel's history. And then, so we start there. That's the historical setting. And then we also like to look at literary context, right? So when we study a book and we want to think about the literary context, what kind of things are we talking about?
Well, first, what happened? And if we're trying to place it, if we're looking at historical piece, we want to know about when it did happen in history.
Yeah, definitely. So the historical context is a piece of it. And then when we look at literary context, then we're talking about, go ahead, Erin, you started to say?
Is it about the story? Is it about the history? Is it about the idea and it's just an allegory?
Well, an allegory is one type of writing. Other types of writing, we did a letter last semester. We have looked at, other genres. The gospel is a genre. So genre is one of the things that we think about when we start to study a book. What genre is it? Because we're going to have very different expectations from a letter or from a poem, right? From a work of kind of the origin story than we would from a work that's more historical. We'll have different ideas based on genre. We also look at authorship. So who wrote it? An audience, who did they write it to? And then the date it's written and its purpose. So that's kind of the starting point that we usually have. We have just different expectations according to who wrote it and why they wrote it and who they wrote it to. And so we're going to dive into those, but we have an extra one for Daniel because usually when we talk about the scriptures, we say Old Testament is written in, anyone remember original language? Hebrew, right? New Testament written in Greek. Yeah, I'm reading lips. Greek. So that is the norm, and that's the case for most of the Bible. And we're in the Old Testament here, and so we expect Hebrew, but Daniel is actually split. Part of it is in Hebrew, and part of it is in another language, Aramaic. Anyone know anything about Aramaic that it might ring a bell in some way?
Isn't that a dead language?
That's an interesting question. I think so.
I think it's a dead language.
Koine Greek.
Jesus
Go
spoke,
ahead.
didn't he?
I couldn't hear you. Go ahead.
Didn't Jesus speak in Aramaic?
Yes, Jesus would have spoken and taught in Aramaic during his ministry because in the area of Palestine, in the time of Jesus, that was the language of the common people. Now, Hebrew was still the language of religion and of the upper class, but the regular people spoke Aramaic. Here is an example. I'll read you this from Mark 5:41. Jesus took the little girl by the hand. This is a little girl he's healing. And he said to her, Talitha koum, which means, little girl, get up. Well, Talitha koum is an Aramaic phrase that literally means arise, lamb. So Jesus, Mark has told us the exact words of Jesus as he spoke to her in Aramaic, which was the language he would have been speaking, to the regular people. Now we ask ourselves, how did Jesus come to be speaking Aramaic, right? How did that happen? And it turns out it was from this time of the Babylonian Empire. Aramaic was the common language of the Babylonians. And so the southern kingdom Israelites, the Judahites, who eventually were called Jews, that's where the name Jews come from, these exiles from Judah, they started speaking Aramaic in Babylonian captivity and ended up bringing, the world, Babylonian Empire sort of had control over a lot of the known world at that point. And so lots of people were speaking Aramaic, and they brought it back with them after the exile, and it stayed a common language over that time. And if we look at Daniel by language, what we see is chapter 1, and actually all the way up to the middle of 2:4 is in Hebrew. And then chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic. And then chapters 8 through 12 are back in Hebrew again. Well, why would there be these different language sections? How could this have happened?
Different authors?
What's that?
Different authors?
Yeah, it's a great option because remember when we were studying some other books, we saw that the biblical authors use sources, don't they? They will often tell you, I'm telling you about the kings, this king and what they did as far as worshiping God. But you can go find out more information about this king in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah or the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And so this is the way ancient writers would cite their sources, right? They would say, there's material here, you can go consult it. Now, in the case of those, we don't have that material. We wish we did. But they had it and they talked about their sources. And so very often, biblical authors, they have the same concern for accuracy that we would, where you go, you find material and then you refer to it saying, this is where I got this information, right? And so we see a lot of times they've pulled together information from sources. Now, does that mean that God didn't inspire it? God still inspires work from source material and work compiling from source material. So this is still a God-led process. This is a process that God does to make his scripture happen. And so it could be that the final author of Daniel pulled in an Aramaic source and left it in Aramaic. Yeah.
And
We don't know.
And this is not the first point where a different language is mentioned in the Bible even, because if you read Esther, documents were sent out throughout the entire land in the languages of the people and places who lived there. And in the battle scenes throughout the history of the kings of Israel and Judah, a foreign king would come up to the gates and announce in the language of the people, so everybody on the walls would lose heart, hey, I'm coming to take over your city.
Right. And at one point, someone says, don't talk to us in that language. Everybody else knows it. We know the other language. Would you just talk to us in that so that people won't understand? And they go, no, we want them to lose heart. Yeah, that's a great example. Now, that does happen. However, the text is mostly in Hebrew all through that time. He says they spoke another language, but you get the text in Hebrew all the way through. Really, this and I think a little section of Ezra. Let me check. Yep. Two small sections of Ezra are the only place where we get a language other than Hebrew in the Old Testament. So we have, this interesting situation where we have, and it sort of forms a design pattern where you get an introduction in Hebrew, and then you get these stories of the Israelites in the Babylonian court in Aramaic, and then you get a set of visions that are in Hebrew, and it's sort of all tied together in an elegant way. So this completed work is nicely done in the way that it's broken up between these two languages. So that brings us to authorship. Who might have written Daniel? Now, who's the most traditional author to whom Daniel is attributed?
Daniel.
Daniel, there you go. It's one of those easy questions, right? And why do some people think that Daniel wrote it?
His name is on it.
Yeah, well, so there's a couple of things, right? For one thing, we've got that big title at the top, so that seems really obvious. But those titles came to be associated with the books as they were, kept and copied and valued by the community of faith over time, right? So the title Daniel gets put on Daniel. Why else?
It's about Daniel.
Say that again, Bethany.
It's about Daniel.
It is. It's about Daniel, and sometimes Daniel is speaking. If you look at the beginning of chapter 8, 9, and 10, all of those visions start out by Daniel saying, I, Daniel, saw this. I, Daniel, did that. And so he's speaking in first person. He says, I looked in my vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel at Susa, and so he's that kind of first person telling in those chapters can make us go like, oh, obviously Daniel wrote this. However, there are some ways that doesn't fit with Daniel writing. For one thing, there's another section of the book that is also written in first person, and it is in the voice of I, Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel chapter 4, let me read you verses 1 through 4. Nebuchadnezzar, the king to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, he's a humble guy, right? May your peace abound. This is a quote, is now Nebuchadnezzar speaking. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. And if you skip down to verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. So here we have Nebuchadnezzar speaking in the first person, and nobody thinks that Nebuchadnezzar wrote Daniel, right? This is presented as a letter that Nebuchadnezzar wrote in his voice, but the way it reads, it's like a literary device, right? Have you ever read a book where like they put in the letter and they're using that as a way to convey that information in someone's direct voice, right? And so this letter is like Nebuchadnezzar himself acknowledges the Most High God. And so that is presented like a literary device in Daniel 4. We don't think Nebuchadnezzar wrote it. And then also Daniel 1 through 6 speak about Daniel and about his friends in third person, right? They say Daniel did this, Daniel did that. And so that doesn't sound like Daniel wrote it. There have been there's a contingent of believers who are very adamant that Daniel must have written Daniel. And if that is your position, that is okay. That's not the position I take because it doesn't seem to fit with the information here. We have all the information about Daniel in the third person, and then it introduces him speaking, and then he speaks his visions, right? Same way it introduces Nebuchadnezzar speaking, and then Nebuchadnezzar publishes his letter, right? My study Bible, I have just a regular like NIV study Bible, and it says the book mentions Daniel as its author. Well, I just don't think the book does that. And I've shown you the passages that they quote, and so you can read that and decide what you think. And it also says that Jesus concurred that Daniel was the author. So let's read that. And you can see if you think Jesus concurred that Daniel was the author. Matthew 24:15. I'm going to start in 14. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, that's a quote from Daniel. It's in Daniel in chapter 9 and 11 and 12. So it's a fairly prominent quote. Jesus is mentioning it, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay, Jesus said, when you see, quote, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet. Is Jesus saying Daniel is the author of the book of Daniel when he says that? It doesn't seem like it to me. Some people say so. I don't think so either. I see some head shakes. And one of the things that happens is there tends to be some back and forth where where some say, like, you're not being faithful enough to the scriptures if you don't think Daniel wrote Daniel. I think we can be very faithful to the scriptures and believe the scriptures are authoritative and look at the way Daniel is written and the genre that it is. And the genre really plays into this. So we mentioned genre before. We talked about, I think y'all mentioned history as a genre. There's also, we talked about letters last semester. That's one genre, prophecies. But Daniel falls under a new genre that we probably have not met if we haven't studied Daniel, some little sections of Isaiah, Ezekiel, and that is called apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is, I'm going to use the share screen again and put up a little list of qualifications for you. Someone in my house is yelling and I don't know why. Okay.
Always yelling in my house.
Okay. These are the characteristics of apocalyptic literature. So this was a genre that was prominent over kind of that turn of the millennium. So a couple hundred years before Jesus to a few hundred years after. It tends to, the Jewish people have a lot of apocalyptic literature that is not, it's intertestamental writings. It's not part of scripture, but there's a lot of it. It tends to originate in groups that see themselves as powerless in the face of evil, like groups that are oppressed tend to generate apocalyptic literature in this period. And it's notable for these first person accounts of visions. I so-and-so saw this thing. And the visions are full of strange symbolic language. They use animals and numbers as symbols. When we peruse Daniel, especially starting in chapter 7, we see lots of that strange symbolic language with animals and numbers. Where else do we see that in the Bible? Weird stuff.
Revelations.
Revelation. Revelation is the other book of scripture that is apocalyptic. And in fact, Revelation is a translation of the word apocalypse. So the name of the book of Revelation in Greek is apocalypse. That's a Greek word that means the unveiling. It doesn't actually mean like the end of the world after which there's dystopian science fiction, right? It doesn't, it's not a disaster, it's an unveiling. So Revelation is a good translation because reveal, right? And apocalypse means revelation. So Revelation is the other one. Another feature is that angels, celestial intermediaries of some sort, seraphim, cherubim, angels, show up, and these angels interpret the visions. That happens in Daniel, it happens in Revelation. And it tends to periodize history, like it divides history into these periods to show the triumph of good over evil. And Daniel really does that. Like that is the point of these visions, is to show that good will triumph over evil in the end. And the point is to disclose these divine mysteries and to provide hope beyond the limitations of the world. Well, people who are suffering, who are disenfranchised, who wonder if maybe they're powerless in the face of evil, are looking for hope. And that is what this genre does, is tell about how God is still sovereign and God is in charge. And we see Daniel fits very, well with that sort of set of descriptions. Questions on that? I could go back to it if you want to see the list again, but.
Another section is the story of Joseph. It's not necessarily quite as apocalyptic, but he has the dreams and he tells Pharaoh, well, I can't tell you what the dream is, but my God can.
But God can. Yeah, that's a great point, because there are lots of parallels between basically captive Jews in a foreign court who are able to interpret dreams and rise in prominence because of it. It's such a great parallel, and I think it's purposeful in Daniel, and we'll definitely talk about that, especially when we get to chapter 2, when we see Daniel showing up to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, because the parallel with Joseph is absolutely there. Yeah, great point. And I'll put some of that, I'll put those passages in your reading so that you'll be able to kind of look at how they follow along with one another. Yeah. So we don't get apocalyptic literature with Joseph, but we get a take on some of those same, some of those design patterns repeat in Daniel to do some of the same thing, right? Show hope, show God's power and God's sovereignty, and that God is still in charge. So we've come to audience, date, purpose, right? And it's really hard to date Daniel, and it is controversial. So those that think that Daniel wrote all of Daniel believe that it was done in Daniel's lifetime, of course, sensible, and sort of at the end of the Babylonian period. So that would have been like, I should have written that down, probably like 530s BC. If you look at this sort of apocalyptic understanding of the genre of Daniel, then the other option for authorship and dating is that someone in the like 160s, during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, pulled a set of existing Aramaic stories as a source, maybe some other material as source material, crafted it into a really elegant, beautifully done whole of Daniel, with the Hebrew frame at the beginning and all the Hebrew visions at the end, to address Jews that were suffering in the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. This was a period that we'll talk about later as we get to the visions that cover Antiochus. They're very specific. They're definitely about him. They get really focused on him and his reign because he was very, very terrible. Okay, so he was really horribly oppressive, torturing and abusing the Jews, and they were suffering. And so in this understanding of Daniel's authorship, what we see is someone going back into history and saying, look, God has been taking care of us under oppressive powers for all these years, and all these stories are stories of God's faithfulness and the faithfulness of his followers that we can take hope from, and God will work this out in the end. And so that is the other way to view the authorship of Daniel. Very different dates, right? One is like 530 BC, the other's like 160 BC. But those are the two options. Questions on that? Either way, we have the sense of like God is still in charge, right? God is the Lord of history. God is sovereign in history. And either way, we still have inspired scripture, whether it's written from multiple sources or if it's written by one person. Either way, we have the idea that, God is still bringing this message through writers, through human writers. God is bringing this message of hope. If in one sense, if Daniel is the original writer, then these visions are predictive, right? They're looking into the future, saying these are the things that are going to happen in the future. The other way, the other authorship idea is looking into the past and saying, like 2 Kings did, this is how we as faith and inspired by God can see what God has done in history up to this point, right? One is predictive, can God predict the future? Yes, of course. Is predicting the future the only thing God does? No, right? So looking back into our past and saying, this is God's view of history, is prophetic in its way, right? That is a word from God. That does help us understand what God is doing when we're suffering. And so that's the message of Daniel that we're looking at. And then we also see that even though, when we get there, you'll see how there's definitely some part of this that was about Antiochus IV. There's also some part that looks towards the future, even our future. When Jesus quoted from Daniel, he said, when you see this happen, then you'll know. So he was telling people to look into the future. Part of that was probably about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But part of it is looking forward, like what happens when we see things falling apart and how do we view that? When Jesus was standing at trial, he called himself a trial in front of the high priest in Mark 14. He called himself one of his favorite titles for himself, and that was the Son of Man. Do y'all remember from when we studied Mark, we talked about the Son of Man and how that title comes from Daniel 7? Let me read to you Mark 14:62. And Jesus said, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man, he's quoting from Daniel there, sitting at the right hand of power. That's a quote from Isaiah. And then he goes back to Daniel, and coming with the clouds of heaven. Daniel 7 shows the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And so Jesus refers to his victory on the cross and his future coming again in terms of the vision of Daniel. So it's not only about the past. This book has a message of hope that also looks towards the future. It's a message of God's sovereignty over history and over the kingdoms of the world that still speaks to us, even in the words of Jesus today. So we'll get to the visions. The visions are definitely weird. Y'all can look forward to some weird stuff. And we're going to unpack it. But the message of God's rule and the eventual defeat of evil powers is always true. There's hope in the book, and it's offered to those who are looking for how to be faithful to God when you're surrounded by a sea of unfaithfulness. And I know we have all felt that way sometimes, that like maybe I'm surrounded by nobody who reveres God. And that was the situation they were in the Babylonian court. And so we'll start looking at that next week when we study the story in chapter 1. We'll also do a more specific look at the themes of Daniel, because we just couldn't fit everything into one lesson. And so we'll continue some more introductory material as we get into this next couple of chapters. Questions or comments?
It's good to see everybody again.
It is. Good to see you, Chris.
Yeah.
We only did 5 verses, and we're doing them again next week. But we got to learn some history. We got to see where it falls in the history of Israel and see sort of, the idea, the presentation of the book and what it's aiming to do. Okay, well, no other comments? Anyone? Sometimes I turn off the recorder and then you'll have comments and then they're not on the recording.
I did get a post from Pam, which had the whiteboards from yesterday. And I was wondering if you were going to put a copy of the whiteboards on your website. I
can put those 2 things. I was left off that inadvertently because of something that, not that Pam did, but something that happened before, but I'll find out what she sent out and I'll make sure that the same content is up there.
Okay.
It was basically a copy of what I put on those boards, in case
Yeah.
you wanted to maybe refer back and you didn't want to scribble it down the whole time. Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to stop the recorder and we can do our prayer time.